Up next, for our next panel, and definitely think about questions if you have any questions, we're going to talk about apps and infrastructure. And when we talk about apps and infrastructure, this is really in line with all the Azure innovations around apps and infrastructure. So with me, I have esteemed colleagues here and friends. So Stephane, why don't you get started? Quick introduction, what's your superpower is around Azure, and why you're here.
Hi, I'm Stephane. So I'm a specialist in Azure infrastructure, so anything VM, storage, network, express route, name it, and hybrid clouds when it comes down to connecting that back to the data center.
Thank you, Stephane. Dileepa?
Yeah, so my name is Dileepa, and I'm a specialist in Microsoft Office 365, specializing in Exchange Online and Office 365 Stack, yeah.
All right, Exchange Online, thank you. John?
Similar to Stephane, Azure Infrastructure Services, virtual machines, networking, and also work with Stephane on Azure Stack. So we can throw or receive some questions on Azure Stack as well.
All right, so with that, let's start with John. Let's talk about Azure Stack. There's
you said something now, right?
So
interesting.
Azure Stack is a phenomenal technology, but for those not familiar, let's get started. What is Azure Stack, and why would companies or customers would want to look at it and invest in that, John?
Okay, so Azure Stack is going to bring to you the edge computing of Azure. So what you're going to have is the ability to bring Azure services on-prem for particular requirements, very, very workload specific. So I'm not saying it's going to do it for everywhere, but if you have a local networking edge workload, this is where Azure Stack, it's going to be on dedicated hardware, it's going to be on sealed hardware. It's not something you play with. It's a sealed service box, supplied by major suppliers like Dell, HP, Lenovo, Cisco, Huawei, and who else, Stephane? Am I missing anyone?
No, that's it.
Okay, that's enough.
For now.
For now. So dedicated workloads, bringing it to the edge, making it look, feel, and taste like Azure on your data center.
So scenarios where, for a lot of different reasons, right? Maybe compliance or maybe connectivity, like on ships or...
A superannuation fund who can't move their data off-prem would be a good example.
Sure.
A health fund, regulatory compliance, definitely. Military mobility,
sure. Defense.
Poor connectivity, or an intense service required right at the edge. Trackside computing at the Grand Prix, so to speak.
Got it. Now, is there any point in time that, let's say I have Azure Stack running, but would it call home at certain instances and connect with Azure and do all those things?
Okay, in the current selection of Azure Stack, you have two options. One, you can be totally disconnected, and that means that you manage all the updates, you filter them down, you bring them, you apply them, and you run that as a totally disconnected environment. That's a capacity model. The other one is the phone home, and that's as a consumption model, so you basically have the services there, but you are connected, you'll receive automatic updates which you must apply within certain windows, and then you can use that and operate that box, but it's as a connected service.
Got it. So Stephane, do you have customers who are leveraging Azure Stack?
Well, Azure Stack is in its infancy, right?
Sure.
So we just started. We just started HP and Dell and all the suppliers have just started to effectively deliver that to Australian customers. We're about to receive our first one, very exciting.
Awesome.
Good toy. So yes, we've been working with customers in terms of proof of concept, POCs.
Got it.
Deploying what we call the Azure Stack SDK, which is the one node version of Azure Stack. So to help customers understand what Azure Stack is and how they can help them, basically. And say, if you have applications or anything that you need, you can do that today on the POC and prove that you can actually test and use Azure Stack in your environment.
So for the customers you work with, right, certainly Azure Stack is very new, but what are some of the most common workloads in Azure that customers take advantage of, especially working with Australian customers that you get engaged with?
Well, Azure Stack today as GM is very limited in the amount of service it can deliver compared to Azure. Now, over time, you're going to have more and more services going to be made available in Azure Stack. But today, it's really mainly applications, VM, compute,
Got it.
storage, and key vaults, right? So what we're really looking at helping customers is if they have applications today that they use in Azure, how can they move that to Azure Stack if they need to? If it needs to be running on-prem, they can just develop for Azure, and then from there just move it if they want to, bring it down to Azure Stack, because it's exactly the same code. It's just Azure Resource Management, and you just move it, basically.
Got it.
So it's very easy.
So let's move Azure Stack aside. Let's talk about Azure in itself. So Dileepa, do you see common use cases for Azure, things like disaster recovery or backup? Are those some of the most common things that customers take advantage of? And what's a typical deployment model looks like, and how fast can they take advantage of those capabilities?
Yeah, so definitely that is one of the typical deployment models that customers can use Azure for, and basically they can look into back up their workloads to Azure Backup. And the other scenario that they should look into is BCDR scenarios when it comes to Azure. So they can easily spin up a secondary data center for their disaster recovery purposes to fail over their primary workloads to Azure. And it's quite easy to set up as well. So if they don't have the in-house knowledge to set up, they can consult Microsoft partners that are available in Australia to get them started with that.
Got it. So who in here are taking advantage of Azure? Anybody using Azure? All right. Sir, so what workload in Azure do you guys use?
Yeah, so we're using Azure Functions.
Azure Functions?
We're using queue messages and virtual machines, virtual networks, and Azure databases.
Got it. So for Azure VMs, are you using it more of a DevOps model, or what do you?
At
what's
the
a use
moment,
case? Yeah.
at the moment, no. It's pretty much a handcrafted sort of setup. So
Got it.
we're hoping to move away from that sort of approach shortly. Hoping to develop those sorts of skills. But yeah, at the moment, it's just sort of handcrafted. Yeah.
All right. What's your name, sir?
Michael.
Michael. Thank you, Michael. All right. So from what you're seeing, right? So we talked about backup, disaster recovery, compute, VM. What are some of the more advanced workloads that you're seeing with your customers that they take advantage of Azure? I mean, they're using queue, messaging, and functions. Anything that comes to mind, Stephane?
Well, there's loads of new technologies in there, and they keep on adding more and more and more.
Yeah,
I mean, you've got blockchain, you've got key
Containers,
vaults, you've got containers. It just keeps on going and going and going, right? So what we've been trying to teach our customers more and more is to effectively move up the stack. Right? Instead of what we consider as a lift and shift and say, just move your VMs to Azure, start to use more of the platform as a service, such as SQL as a service,
100%.
such as Key Vault and the functions, and start to move that up the stack. Not only it's going to be cheaper for you, but then you can also leverage a lot more of the features and functionality of Azure as opposed to what you used to do previously on premises with just VMs.
Absolutely. I mean, obviously step one, right? Move your VM, move your compute, but the advanced workloads I can't even do on-prem. Things like cognitive services, Cosmos DB. I mean, those require a lot of power.
It's traditionally you would need months, if not years, of development, of implementation. It's a massive project which would end up costing millions of dollars. That now you just turn it on, pay it, $20, you're done. That's it. Turn it off. Use it whenever you need to.
John, what are any specific customer you can think of that has a fascinating use case around Azure? And what they're using?
What I'm seeing at the moment with Azure is we're starting to move into the monitoring and the management plane, the control plane deployments, and that's typically like we take network performance monitoring part of log analytics. That sounds pretty innocuous, but you deploy an agent, and suddenly I'm looking at my network links, telling me my latency and the up and down of the link itself. And it's not just doing it as a straight, hey, let's just have a bit of pinging going across our network. What it's doing is actually doing synthetic transactions, reporting them to Azure, knowing where its neighbors are, and from that working out automatically the thresholds, the network map, and giving you a picture So the whole monitoring story is changing and changing rapidly.
Sure.
And this is part of log analytics. It's part of the storage of data and event logs, and it's across Windows and Linux. We love everybody now in the nicest possible commercial way.
That's right.
And that is safe to say that we look after Linux as first class as Windows when it comes to monitoring and logging.
Right.
So I'm seeing a lot of that at the moment.
Any questions for the experts around Azure? Yes, sir. All right, so, all right, questions?
Probably more a question for you, actually.
Me?
Yes, because you did question the other gentleman about the DevOps model.
Sure.
Can you explain what you define as the DevOps model?
So, wow, he put me on the spot here. Now, pop quiz. No, so traditionally, right? So a lot of, because of the cloud, the agility of the cloud, where traditionally, if everything's on-prem or we're developing software, you know, there's the dev, test, prod, where the idea of DevOps, at the very simplistic way, is because of the cloud, we can quickly spin up environments where we could do development and operations quickly at the same time. So that's one of the value prop that cloud platforms like Azure can provide. Because apart from the traditional VMs you can set up to do your development and operations, then you can take advantage of a lot of these platform as a service, advanced workload. Any other points you want to make?
I'll always jump in from an infrastructure side. To me, when they start to talk about DevOps, that's where I'm defining all my infrastructure as code. And I'm turning everything in to be something that I can automate. And by that I mean start with an ARM template, like JSON templates, the ARM APIs. I then go to something like configuring all my VMs, my networks, creating those as code, and then hooking them in through PowerShell so that when I need to take an action in a runbook, I don't go and manually start up a VM. I get somebody like PowerShell to kick off the VM, to run it up, and then later perhaps tear it down. So I look at the DevOps from the infrastructure side as where I'm turning around the actual infrastructure to be quickly built and when needed, quickly pulled down. And that's where the GitHub and the quick start templates, all of that is absolutely awesome.
And consistently.
I don't want to run it.
Exactly. And consistently. It's always the same. You know it's always the same because it comes off the same script, the same image.
I mean, one thing, I don't know if you guys are keeping up. So there was an event, I think, early this morning in the States. It's called Microsoft Connect. So there's a lot of new Azure announcement. Well, one of the things that was announced was the Azure free trial. And you can start playing around with these things. So you talk about the ARM templates. You can also go to the Azure Marketplace to start spinning up all these. You don't have to build your VM from scratch, but all these purpose-made environments so you can quickly start building and deploying infrastructure, as John mentioned.
So search for ARM GitHub, and you'll see the repository there, and you literally have, you can either look at the code and mess about with the code, or just you have a button to say deploy in Azure now, and it just deploys whatever the code is about onto Azure straight up. So
I have to ask Dileepa. So one of the value of Azure is identity, right? AAD. And you know, I know you will work a lot with Exchange Online. So how do you see the value of AAD for things like Exchange Online, or even if there's an IaaS setup of Exchange in Azure?
So basically, I work a lot with Exchange Online and Office 365. So AAD is the key concept when it comes to synchronizing the on-prem Active Directory users to Azure or Office 365 directories for identity purpose, right? So if you talk about AAD in a much more broader view, you can probably expand that to bring in other companies as well, like in the Azure B2C model and B2B model, stuff like that. And you can extend the functionality of AAD to those areas as well to have a holistic approach with regards to identity.
And then from even a hybrid setup, right? We talked about hybrid earlier with ADFS. I think you know, the capabilities that Azure provide through AAD, and you combine it with your on-prem.
That's
AD.
right. That's right. And it's actually very simple to set up. To actually just even start with just a simple synchronization up to the cloud to AAD from your own Active Directory without impacting your Active Directory on-prem. You can actually have all your identity already now in Azure, and cut it off if you want to. It's absolutely no problem, but it will help you to go down the path of later on having potentially single sign-on and then add to that ADFS if you have in-house application for authentication purposes, etc.
I mean, to me, that's a requirement if you want to think about it. Like, if you're going to invest and go to the cloud, definitely set up your AAD, ADFS appropriately, because everything else after that requires it.
Step number one, right?
Exactly.
Authentication. The ability to log on onto your Azure environment is key. Yep. And you don't want the additional email address with the additional password. You just want to use whatever you use at work. Log on, that's it. And that's what the very first AD Connect will provide to you.
100%. Any other questions around Azure? Yes, sir. Emma, do you want?
Hi. Just talking about Active Directory as a special case. Our team discovered that in Azure you can only have one domain, whereas on premises we often have a number of domains. So that seems to me to be a limitation with Azure. I was just wondering, is that actually correct? And secondly, when you're trying to synchronize on premises with Azure, there is some kind of limitation as to the number. Our organization has hundreds of thousands of users, and we're finding that update requires a number of iterations.
John,
Stephane, you want to take that?
So for your first question, consider your AAD traditionally, so when you create a tenant in Azure, it's the equivalent of a local forest, right? So you technically will have one AAD per forest. And then any subdomains with that, you can actually manage that within your AAD. Now, if you do want multiple AADs with multiple tenants, you can still organize a synchronization between multiple domain on premises and multiple AADs in the cloud. So you do have that multiple to multiple. But once you replicate one of your Active Directory, you go to one AAD, not multiple. That's the general principle.
Yeah, so you also can replicate multiple UPNs in that case. So
that's correct.
So it gets replicated to Azure Active Directory as is.
Along with all your domains, basically. So that's, yeah. In terms of limitations, I don't know if you guys have ever better... Look, I don't know in terms of hundreds of thousands of objects. I can see how AAD Connect must start to struggle a little if you got so many objects to actually iterate through at every synchronization. But I don't know what the actual limitation is of the number of objects there. So we will have to take this offline with some Microsoft experts.
Yeah, probably one area to look into, if you've got hundreds of thousands of users, whether something like a B2C model, business to consumer model, which is, I think, the free version or the low-cost version is about 500,000 users. So it might be something like that the different brackets of usage has come up, but I know I think with more detail on that.
Yeah, or to split your AD connects amongst multiple servers as opposed to have one AD Connect that just replicates everything. You start to segregate that and go, this AD Connect server will replicate this OU versus this OU, and then accelerate the performance that way.
Yeah. Did that answer your question, sir? Yeah, all right. Well, guys, I mean, we have a few minutes left and a lot of great questions, but before we take off, what words of wisdom can you impart on how folks can get started with leveraging Azure for their apps and infrastructure? So let me get started with John.
Okay, well, the obvious one is, okay, if you're used to running a VM environment, a lot of that can step up, and we have some great tools like Azure Site Recovery. Not many people realize you can actually migrate your environment VMs from on-prem to Azure, and if you do it within 31 days, it's free to use the tool. So that's a great starting step. We have some fantastic documentation, labs, all that sort of stuff, all online, but the best way to get started is get a subscription, stand up some VMs, start using the GitHub quick start templates, build up an environment, because what you'll get is our patterns and practices out of the box for setting up a DMZ, for setting up your load balancers, all of that, and that just makes it a lot easier, because what you'll want is once you're in Azure is those same capabilities, backup, disaster recovery, protection, security that you've developed on-prem. They don't go away. So a lot of those capabilities stay with you. the skills, upgrade into Azure.
Awesome. Thank you, John. Dileepa?
Yeah, so now the Microsoft has no limitations when it comes to migrating your on-prem workloads to Azure. Like, it supports Linux as well, so as long as you have Windows and Linux and other systems that are supported on Azure, you can migrate them. And as John mentioned, you can always create a tenant and then see how it applies to your environment.
Stephane?
Start with one area in Azure. Don't try and focus on everything in Azure because that's massive and really overwhelming. So go for the low-hanging fruits. You know, migrate your types from backup to types to backup to clouds. Do an IAD connect to use Active Directory and get that single sign-on going. Use VMs, things like that. But try and focus on one area at a time. Don't do it all at once.
Yep. I agree with Stephane. One area that's a quick win, low-hanging fruit, is Azure File Share, right?
Yes, that's correct.
I mean, to your business, they'll look at it as like your file share, but essentially you moved everything to Azure with Azure File Share service.
That's right, yeah.
So with that, thank you guys. Let's give them a big round of applause. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right.